The room was silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat. I stood in the middle of a bedroom larger than the entire apartment I had called home for 11 years. Chandelier overhead, fresh flowers I hadn't asked for, and a stillness so thick it felt like holding your breath underwater. This was my wedding night, and what happened next stopped me completely. Not with fear, not with regret, with something I had no word for yet. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because to truly understand what happened in that room, you need to know who I was before I ever walked through his door. You need to know the woman who woke up every morning to a quiet so heavy it had weight. The woman who had stopped expecting phone calls, surprises, or reasons to dress up. The woman the world had quietly stopped noticing, and who, somewhere along the way, had started agreeing with them. I was 51 years old, and I had become very good at disappearing. Not the dramatic kind. No sudden exits, no slammed doors. The quiet kind. The kind where you shrink so gradually that one morning you look in the mirror and realize you can barely remember the last time someone looked at you and truly saw you. My first marriage had done that. Not with cruelty, at least not the kind that leaves marks anyone else can see. It had done it the way erosion works, slowly, consistently, until what remained was a version of me that had learned to take up less space, ask for less, expect less, and call that peace. After the divorce, I moved into a small apartment on a tree-lined street that smelled like wet leaves in autumn and old wood in summer. I made coffee every morning in the same chipped mug. I walked the same route to the community hospital where I volunteered 3 days a week, handing out books to patients who had too much time and not enough distraction. My neighbor, Dora, 73, sharp-tongued, and the only person who ever knocked on my door without a reason, would sometimes call out from her window as I passed. "You're too young to walk like that," she'd say. I never knew quite what she meant. I think now that I do. People were kind to me the way people are kind to someone they feel sorry for. Gentle, careful, the way you speak to someone standing near the edge of something. I wasn't broken exactly. I was simply absent, present in body, somewhere else entirely in spirit. I had stopped waiting for my life to change. I had stopped leaving room for it. And then, as lives sometimes do when you finally stopped demanding anything of them, mine stopped asking for my permission. It was raining the afternoon I met him. Not a dramatic storm, just the kind of steady, indifferent drizzle that makes the whole world look like it's been filmed through frosted glass. I was leaving the hospital, coat pulled close, mind already halfway home, when I noticed an older man standing just outside the entrance with no umbrella and no apparent urgency about the fact that he was getting soaked. He was looking at the sky the way people look at something they've made peace with. I didn't think. I just stopped, opened my umbrella, and held it over both of us without a word. He turned and looked at me. I want to be careful here, because what I say next will sound like something from a story someone invented. But he was not what I expected. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than a man his age had any right to be, with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm, but from having survived things. His hair was silver, his jaw was set, and his eyes, dark and unhurried, held the particular weight of someone who has learned that most things people say are not quite what they mean. He thanked me quietly. I said something ordinary. We stood beneath my small umbrella for less than 3 minutes while the rain made up its mind. Then his car arrived, long, black, discreet, and he was gone. I walked home, unable to explain the particular silence he had left behind. I told myself it was nothing. I made my coffee, I sat by the window, and I thought about those eyes in the way you think about a song you can't name, circling it, unable to let it go. 3 days later, a friend mentioned his name in passing. She showed me a photograph on her phone, some charity gala, columnists hovering nearby. And there he was, the man from the rain, Elias Voss, 71 years old, one of the wealthiest men in the country. The world tilted, quietly, completely, and without asking my permission. He found me again on a Tuesday. I was arranging donated books in the hospital's common room when I felt the shift in the air before I saw him. That particular stillness he carried, walking in ahead of him like a quiet announcement. He didn't offer an elaborate explanation for why he was there. He simply said he had been meaning to increase his donation to the hospital's library program and had asked to meet the volunteer who ran it. I knew, even then, that this was not entirely true, and I think he knew that I knew. We said nothing about that. Instead, we talked for 40 minutes about books, which ones had made us feel less alone, which ones we had abandoned halfway through and why, and by the time he left, something had shifted in the room that I couldn't shift back. After that, there were walks. He had an estate outside the city with gardens that had clearly been designed by someone who understood that beauty should feel inevitable rather than arranged. He walked beside me through those gardens with his hands clasped behind his back, speaking carefully, as though words were something he had learned to spend wisely after years of having them misused. I learned that he had lost his wife 8 years earlier, quietly, after a long illness, and that the grief had not destroyed him so much as hollowed him out in a way he had never fully bothered to repair. I told him about my marriage, about the erosion. He listened without rushing me toward resolution, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years. The first time he touched my hand, it was to steady me on an uneven garden path. He didn't release it immediately. I didn't move away. We both pretended not to notice, which meant we both noticed entirely. Then came the afternoon his nephew, sharp-suited, cold-eyed, and clearly threatened by something he hadn't been consulted about, made a remark at a small family gathering just loud enough for me to hear. Something about women who appear in wealthy men's lives right on schedule. Elias turned. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. What he said was brief, precise, and final in the way that only genuine authority ever sounds. Then he looked at me with an expression that asked nothing and offered everything. That was the moment I stopped pretending I wasn't falling. The world has very strong opinions about who deserves to be loved, and by whom, and under what circumstances. I learned this quickly. It started online, the way most cruelty does now, at a safe distance, behind screens and anonymous names. Someone had photographed us walking together near the estate. The image was unremarkable. 2 people, side by side, mid-conversation, but the captions that attached themselves to it were not. Gold digger was the kindest word used. The rest painted a picture of a calculating woman who had identified a lonely, aging man and positioned herself with surgical precision. There were threads dissecting my appearance, my divorce, my modest address. There were people who had never met me constructing a detailed and confident portrait of my character. And there were people close to Elias, people whose opinions he had respected for decades, who began to quietly agree. His nephew moved from veiled remarks to direct action. There were fabricated stories placed in the right ears. There was a photograph, taken out of context, arranged to suggest something that had never happened, that circulated through his inner circle like a slow poison. I watched people who had smiled warmly at me begin to look through me instead. I watched Elias absorb it all with a jaw set so tight it looked like effort. And I made a decision. Not from weakness. I want to be precise about that. I made it from the only place I had left that still felt entirely mine. My dignity. I could not be the reason his world fractured. I could not be the story that followed his name for the rest of his life. So I went to him one evening, sat across from him at that long table in the room where we had talked for hours about books and grief and gardens, and I told him I was letting him go. That what we had built deserved better than what the world was going to do to it. That I loved him too honestly to stay and watch it burn. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I've spent 8 years letting things go. I'm not doing it again." And so we come back to that bedroom. I stood there on our wedding night, chandelier overhead, fresh flowers I hadn't asked for, and I finally let myself look at what he had done with the room. Not what the interior designer had done, what he had done. Because scattered among the grandeur, placed with a care that made the grandeur irrelevant, were things that had no business being in a room like that unless someone had put them there on purpose. A small framed photograph of my late mother, which I had mentioned exactly once in passing and never expected anyone to remember. A first edition of the novel I had told him made me feel less alone the winter after my divorce. And on the bedside table, folded with the particular neatness of something written and rewritten many times, a letter. I sat on the edge of that enormous bed and I read it slowly. He wrote about the rain, about a woman who had stopped to hold an umbrella over a stranger without hesitating, without calculating, without wanting anything in return, and how that single, unremarkable gesture had cracked something open in him that 8 years of carefully managed solitude had almost permanently sealed. He wrote that he had not been looking for love, that he had, in fact, made a quiet, private agreement with himself that love was something that had already happened to him once, and that asking for it twice was more than a man in his position had any right to expect. And then he wrote the line that I have returned to every day since. "You didn't make me fall in love with you. You made me remember that I was still someone who could." I sat with that sentence until the candles had burned lower and the room had grown soft with shadow. When he came in and found me there, he didn't ask what I was feeling. He simply sat beside me, took my hand the way he had on that uneven garden path, and didn't let go. There was no performance in that room, no conquest, no transaction. Just two people, each carrying the careful weight of lives already lived, choosing, with full knowledge of every scar, to begin again. The mansion is different now. I notice it in small ways. The way laughter travels differently through rooms that were once too quiet. The way sunlight seems to stay longer in spaces that are actually lived in. Elias walks differently, lighter through the shoulders, more present in his eyes, as though love has quietly returned something the years had been slowly borrowing. I notice that too, every day. I still volunteer at the hospital. I still walk the same tree-lined streets, still stop to talk to Dora when she calls from her window. I have not traded myself for this life. I have simply brought myself into it, fully, finally, without apology. That, I think, is the part no one writes about. That real love doesn't ask you to disappear into it. It asks you to arrive. And if you have stayed with this story until now, I suspect you already understand why. Maybe your life has gone quieter than you expected. Maybe love has already visited you once and left, and you have made your own private agreements about whether it is reasonable to ask for it again. Maybe the world has had opinions about your choices, your age, your worth, your timing. Let it. Some love arrives late precisely because it needed you to become exactly who you are now in order to find you. And that is never, ever a story too late to begin.